let's get into identify and intervene. We'll talk about finding and correcting some of the faults you're going to see from your digitizing from your files. First thing I'm going to say is, if anybody hasn't told you this yet, the screen is lying to you. It doesn't want you to do well. It's trying to make you fail. So if you look at things on screen and they look perfect on the screen, it is lulling you into a false sense of security that will have you ruining stuff on the machine. We look at this piece here, this word consulting. Look at how different. We have a nice straight line underneath that, aside from some optical balance that we've added for the round letters. That's something that's common even in print. But look at how different those top lines and bottom lines are in the file. That is the result of that file. Pull and push compensation are always happening, or pull and push distortion, always happening in your designs. And so invariably, this is what's going to happen. Columns get thinner, taller, and change. If we know this ahead of time and we stop trusting the screen, we won't want to make changes. One of the first things I'll see young editors do when they first start editing other people's designs is they go in here and see that, and then they start making everything all the same height. And then they have a massive difference in all the different heights of the letters because they don't know what they changed. And the problems are pull and push distortion. No matter what you're doing, pull and push distortion are always happening, even on the most stable materials. Even polyester twill will have some push, some pull. And what this means is if we're looking at a column of stitches in front of us, a satin stitch, all stitches have pull distortion. They get narrower. It will always get narrower once it's under tension on the machine. If we're looking at this T-bar here, also, we'll see at the bottom of that bar, the open end of the satin stitch, and it's the same with fills. That open side, that is always going to get taller. If we had a capital I, solid bar I, it would get taller and skinnier. Same thing as we look at that crossbar horizontally, it's going to get shorter and stick out wider. Pull and push distortion is always happening, and the material is also gathering, so you'll sometimes see puckers on large satin stitches because the satin stitch is pulling under tension and trying to pull that material into the center. We're tying a knot and pulling it tight. So what you're going to see on your designs is if we're trying to hit this finished blue baseline here, you have to stop short on the ends of your columns and you have to swing long on the sides. So what that means in a very simple way is this. If you want this red rectangle here, you have to draw this blue rectangle to get it. So I can tell you standard numbers. Everybody says, what's this number that you can give us? If you're on a piqué polo, probably 0.17 millimeters or 0.2 millimeters on each side will probably get you there. But the thing is, that's going to differ depending on the polo and the structure and the stretch. The thing to know is, any satin you see on screen is going to be wider and shorter than it will be when you actually stow it. So pull and push compensation is something we have to understand. Like I said, especially evident in satin stitch text. You're going to see top lines and base lines look very distorted. Don't worry about that. The other thing I'm going to say too, we'll bring back this, I didn't talk about optical balance. All round letters, even in true type fonts in print, O's, S's, G's, anything like that, Q's, go a little bit above and below the baseline because the human eye just sees those round letters as being shorter. If you grab all of those and try and shrink those down to those top lines, base lines, they will always look short and weird. So one of the other things that people accidentally correct is trying to pull back on that optical balance. That's a design thing, it's not even an embroidery thing. So, registration errors. These are pretty common, especially when we're talking about straight line borders like this, where we have some gaps that show up in our designs. Well, let's talk about how we correct some of those registration errors. So the first thing is this interaction. Straight stitch borders around the ends of satin stitches, we're dealing with push again. If we look at the fingers on this character here, the Sundari Imports lady that I did years ago, one of my first little award pieces. The first time I ran it, all of these fingers were sticking out of the vinyl borders that we were doing. Why is this? Push. If we look at those satin stitches, there are our satin ends. They're going to keep pushing out beyond where I drew them. In the case of trying to get those to line up, laser lined with that little straight stitch line, we have to stop early behind where they're supposed to fill in for them to be there. On the actual design, you will see a gap. That is normal. If we're seeing stitches stick out from the ends, all we really have to do is this, and this is all of these corrections that we need to make. Number one, if you are going to edit designs from someone, the best way you can do it, I'm just going to let you know, is to have the same software your digitizer has, then you can access the actual shapes. You'll be able to grab the shapes that are generating the stitches and move the ends in. If you don't, if you have to edit, you just have a little bit of that satin stitch sticking out beyond the end, you can look at how many stitches are hanging out beyond the outline that escape the outline and just delete those with your editing software. So you just have a little place where something is missing the border. You can either move the border out further or you can just delete the rows that stick out. And frankly, that is easy enough to do. In this case, the first time I ran it, I had about 2 rows of stitching that were sticking out, so about 0.3 millimeters. I grabbed the stitches at the end, selected them, and deleted them back. In this case, if you're doing it with your actual file, we can see that we have the digitizing object, the original satin stitch column. You would grab these 2 points at the end of this vector-like object and drag them back by about 2 rows. When you want to correct anything that is going wrong on the actual sew out, if you measure what's wrong and correct by that distance, even though it's going to look very wrong on screen, reliably, if you don't change anything else about your process, it'll stitch the way you want it to. If it's too far out by a millimeter and you drag it back by a millimeter, even though it looks like it has a gap on screen and we know it's going to keep pushing that same amount, that will be what we need to correct, as long as you don't change anything else about how you're running. So a rough idea of necessary corrections for these push compensation problems is literally counting the number of escaped rows of stitching, and that works pretty well. So 2 rows of filler escaping top and bottom of these. The dad hat that had this little cherry design on it. When I got it done, I can see that I've got about 2 rows of this red stitching popping out top and bottom. Because I have a roughly horizontal stitch angle that's going through this thing, I can tell you it's going to pull this way, it's going to push this way. Once these are going up and down like that, I'm like, all right, I need just about 0.4 millimeters to fix that. I can grab the points that are at the top of the cherries and drag them further inside the line than it looks like they should be. On the actual file, I'll see a gap. But once it sews, I know that that push is going to close that gap for me. But the other thing I can do is just delete those 2 rows. If I was doing this with a stock file and I only had a couple rows of stitching out, I would lasso those in with my editing software, stitch editing software, delete the rows. As long as it doesn't do anything to the travel stitching, you should be fine. And most of the time, at the ends of these things, 2 rows is going to be 1 pass, so you're actually going to be on the same side that thing ended. Let's say we ended a fill on that side, we delete 2 rows, we're still at the same place we started from. So it's just about counting what's sticking out, measuring it, and counteracting it. It's actually a lot simpler than it seems to fix these problems. Though, I'm going to just prove a point here. People will tell me, it's like, okay, I run patches, there is no amount of distortion that's going to happen. This is absolute hardcore patch twill with stabilizer in it, and even with that, absolutely the best case scenario in a spanned hoop. I threw these at about 3 millimeters and they came in by about 0.2 mils. So what this means is my lettering didn't look as bold as I wanted it to. If I had outlined that lettering, it would have missed it by just a little bit. Now that's a very small amount of distortion, but it's there just to show you that even under the best conditions on the best materials, you're always going to see a little bit of pull and a little bit of push. It's always happening all the time because we are constantly stacking thread and stabbing thread thousands of times through fabric. This distortion is always happening. Cool thing is, if you really wanted to fix that, once again, if I've got 3 mils on screen and that's what I really wanted, but I end up with 2.8 down here, it's a little too thin, if I grab the edges of that design or increase the pull compensation setting by that 0.2 mils, that means it's going to run the thickness that I intended it to on the actual piece. Correct by the amount that it's wrong, even though it makes the on-screen design look too bold, too thick. Because the on-screen design doesn't matter. The only thing that ever matters is the final stitch result. We don't produce files, we produce embroidery. Don't care about that screen, I can't tell you that enough. Same thing when we have gapping like this. If you've got fills that aren't meeting the edges of satin stitches and they're all on the same angle, we can see it's in the angle of the fill. That means we've got things that are pulling apart. If we don't have sufficient overlapping, fills can pull short of their borders. A lot of time when I see this is from people who are very worried about stacking too much. They think about density being stacked on top of each other and they get very worried. I'm just here to tell you a layer of satin stitch, the penetration points are all on the edge on satin. Satin stitch layering on top of fill is fine. You can have a very deep overlap on this stuff and be just fine. It doesn't matter if it's more than you think you need. So without having sufficient overlaps, they can pull short of the borders. The thing to think about is even if the angles are slightly offset that we see here, if 2 things are meeting in that same angle, well, we know what pull does, right? Pull compensation, pull distortion makes things narrow out. If everything just meets on screen, then by the time we do a little bit of pull, we're going to see a gap as things pull apart. So we know that if we want those two little pieces to interact correctly, they're still in those same 2 angles, we're going to have to overlap them deeply so that when they pull, they don't come apart. So any items that just meet in that angle that their stitches pull need to be overlapped pretty heavily to avoid gapping. The thing is though, you literally just measure the gap of the border and then move that background edge further than the gap. If you're seeing a 1 millimeter gap, don't just move it over by 1 millimeter if you're going under a satin border. Why? Because yeah, maybe we'll get to a point where now the satin border and pull, we've counteracted it. We moved that millimeter gap, but now we're just barely hitting. If anything goes wrong on the machine, if we snag, if we move, anything goes weird, we'll see little bits of gaps that are still occurring. We want a nice deep overlap so that even after the pull is done, we still have some meat to that overlap so that we don't see problems under little bits of movement that could happen. So we want to see, like I said, over here it looks like an incredibly deep overlap. It looks like it's too far. And in fact, sometimes you will pull a border or a fill, and the fill will look like it's escaping the sides of the border. But if we know that it's pulling in more than that, we just have to trust that once we get to the machine, that same amount of distortion is going to happen. So one thing I am going to say though, like I said previously, the best way to do any of this editing is if you have the digitizing format that your digitizer uses, or if you're working on this yourself. One of the things I'm going to show you is with stitch editing. But in the end, though I talk about all this editing, if you are doing a ton of stitch editing, you have a digitizer problem, not a software problem. Every time somebody's like, yeah, this guy's file, they're great, they work great. All I have to do, and then they tell me a 10-step process they go through to vet and fix every file they get. That's not an awesome digitizer. Might be a cheap digitizer, I don't know. But that's a digitizing problem, not an editing problem. So when we're editing things like this, if we have the digitizing objects and our software is the same software they use because the file formats don't transfer across, we can just select the nodes of the line that defines the fill edge and nudge it or drag it further into the border, no big problem. But when we're doing stitch editing, it can be a lot harder to do. You'll have to isolate the fill that's underneath it and grab all the individual stitch penetration points at the edge. So if we've got our digitizing objects, all we have to do is grab 2 points and drag it over on this particular rectangle. If we're over here in stitch editing, I have to carefully select and isolate out of one color change just the ends of the stitches on that one side and drag them under. If you are doing this consistently on somebody's file, you need to tell them if there's any way you can. I mean, don't get me wrong. Have we done this? Lots? Tons, because sometimes you can't get somebody for 24 hours and the job is on the machine now. But if you're doing this consistently, it's time to talk to the digitizer about their settings. But there are some things that can help you. There are automated softwares that have automated compensation, even on stitch files, where you can select a block of stitches and just use a slider to compensate. The problem with that is most of those softwares, if you select a whole block, it'll go both edges. It'll just compensate all the stitches when you slide it over. So if you have that kind of software, you're still going to have to select that edge. The one thing I'll tell you can do, grab your different color changes and lock everything except for the fill that you're working on, and it just means that you can't accidentally select stitches you don't mean to. If you're doing stitch editing, the worst thing you can do is just start trying to individually select stitch points in the middle of a multi-layer file, because you are invariably going to grab something you don't mean to. Cool thing is, if you have these softwares, not all editing softwares have this, you can then just select the inside of that fill when you see how it's not touching further enough, it's not overlapping far enough inside of the satin border, and we literally click this compensate slider and drag it over, and it just drags those points over to the edge, further deeper into that border. The thing I will warn you about is when we're doing it in a stitch editing style, you can see that the minimum stitches that are out here and these little chisel points, you might have to select back into those stitches and you will get some textural difference. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of shine on that inner edge because you make some of the stitches longer at the edge of that fill, and it can change the texture just a little bit. So once again, your best option always is if you can use the original digitizing objects if you have to edit stuff. So great idea. If you're looking for a digitizer, ask them what stuff they use. And if it's your software, you've got a better chance of being able to fix small things as you need to have them come up. But yeah, pull compensation, just remember, if it meets perfectly on screen, it will miss in the thread. Distortion on screen can be perfection on the machine, but perfection on screen will always be distorted at the machine. So when it looks perfect on screen, you know you're in for trouble. The next one is shape distortion. This is something that young digitizers do, and I'm going to show you samples that make me feel terrible here shortly, because they're from my early career in digitizing. Pull and push forces can lead to shape distortion. And the one that young digitizers do, they grab a vector of a nice circle, they throw it on screen, fill it, and when they run it, it's an egg, it's an oval, it looks terrible. If you've never seen a circle turn into an oval, you haven't been embroidering much. Pull and push force is going to lead to shapes shrinking in the angle of pull and growing in the angle of push, and this is how we end up with eggs, right? Circular filled objects, common problem, they always look like ovals. And this is where I cry a little inside and reveal that I wrecked a bunch of stuff for Civ 10 International when I first started digitizing. Very obviously, I wasn't paying attention to that. And you can see that not only do I have that problem, but see those little gaps here and the yellow that's sticking through? I also didn't overlap my borders very well, and I didn't account for the fact that in this angle, I was going to get a ton of pull. So the lettering still is in the round it's supposed to be, but that oval is from that really densely filled circle, pushing out, warping my material, and pulling in from the sides. The great thing is, it's really not that hard to change. We purposefully draw shapes that are distorted in the angles of push and pull to stop it. So if you want circles, you have to learn to draw ovals, and you have to draw them at the right angles. It looks like this. You can correct this in any circle by measuring the deviation between the stitch out and the circle. If we measure along the stitch angle and it is too short, too narrow by 2 millimeters, pull it out by 2 millimeters. If it is too tall by 2 millimeters, shrink it by 2 millimeters. What is it going to look like? It's going to look like an oval going the other direction on screen. But if we know that's the distortion we're going to get on the machine, by the time we stitch it out, the oval will now turn into a circle. We have to know that the file is not the end product. So once we can measure that deviation, I mean literally get yourself a caliper, get yourself a ruler, and if it's wrong by an amount, that's what we switch in the final piece. So yeah. The other problem we have is this one. And once again, I cry a little tear because about how badly I did, because this is not supposed to be a rhombus. We are not the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This is supposed to be a square. However, it is not a square. Why is it not a square? A couple different reasons. There is also a material impact. When you're on certain materials, you'll find that they don't all stretch the same. A woven material, fairly often, will be real strong in the horizontal, real strong in the vertical, but on the bias, you'll grab that thing on the bias on a 45 degree and see it stretch. Well, if you put your fills on that 45-degree angle, you think they're not stretching that more than they could? Absolutely, especially if you don't have enough stabilization. So whenever we have fills on a 45-degree angle, it's usually done because we're trying to avoid splitting, which I'll tell you later about how borders split these things and let some of the background show through. We'll talk about that in a second. People say, all right, you're having issues with the border at the top and the bottom looking weird. Put all your fills at 45 degrees, you'll fix everything. Aside from the fact that it's going to pull these things along the angle of pull and along the angle of push, it's going to push out. And in fact, what you can see about this little rhombus of mine, despite the horrible stitch quality, is that this little yellow point is sticking out here. And you'd be like, oh, you've got a trim or something's off of there. Absolutely not. The fill has turned into such a diamond that that is the point of the fill sticking out of the border on the corner. So honestly, running 45-degree angle fills is not great. Lesser angles really are going to be better for you and still be able to avoid that splitting, and we'll talk about it in a second. But 45-degree fills often put the stress on the weakest dimension of the garment. On that bias, many materials are very stretchy, and you can't always rely on stabilizer to fix all of that. So that's something a digitizer can change by just changing from something like this 45 to like a 15-degree angle. So I will show you what I'm talking about with splitting in a second, and you'll see that it's another correction people have that they often have to do with borders. But lower stitch angles can be a better way to be a little more nice to the garment and not distort that material so much. Even so, you do still have to have considerable overlaps. And I will say this, when I have to run an angled fill and I know that I'm coming out to these points, the other thing we can do is crop the points, and I'll kind of show you that real quickly. If I'm running this fill, we know that in this angle I'm going to pull, in this angle I'm going to push. I can actually crop the point off right where the border intersects, and you'll see that I just cut these little points off. Two things happen here. I remove little tiny short stitches, because as this thing keeps trying to fill, it's going to drop little tiny short stitches filling that corner. And if I had a fairly extreme kind of stretch like you saw there, this point won't stick out. Especially if we're doing something like a little straight stitch border, doing this means you won't have those corners of the fill trying to poke out of your border. So that's another thing that you can do or require somebody to do, ask somebody to do if you're having that issue where at the corners, those little edges that are in that push dimension, the fill's poking out. That's one way you can fix that. But this is the problem people are usually trying to fix. It's a satin and a fill interaction that I always call splitting, where you have a satin border on a fully horizontal fill and it's like a square border on all sides. The sides look kind of okay, but maybe they're starting to blend because the stitch angle is the same. But on the top, when we have the satin border run across that fill, it's hitting that fill all on one line of stitching, meaning that as that starts to pull apart, it grabs this fill underneath and spreads the thing out. So you'll see on a lot of rectangles and squares where there's gaps at the top and bottom of the border, this is usually what's happening. If we tilt the fill to that 15 degrees instead of being fully horizontal, it will stop that from happening pretty well. Why? Because now that we've tilted it, when that satin stitch comes down to pull, it's pulling on different lines of that fill, and it's not just taking two lines and spreading them apart. So that can help with that splitting without us doing anything extra. You will also sometimes see digitizers lay a little piece of zigzag underlay or something under that joint. You can do that, and that's fine. It's more stitching than I think you need. So for me, I will usually change that angle. Also, because when you lay satin stitches on top of a fill and they're all in exactly the same angle, which that horizontal means all your vertical stems are going to be in that same angle as satin stitch, you'll see blending as that top stitch tries to sink into that bottom fill stitch at the same angle. When we're trying to actually blend something on purpose, One of the rules is that all the stitches have to be in the same angle for it to blend correctly. Well, that also goes against us when we don't want blending to happen. If things interact at the same angle on top of each other, the stitches try to sink into each other under tension. So, we'll talk a little bit about text. I cannot tell you how many crossbars of A's I have dropped in stock text in my life, but it's a lot. If you have little tiny capital A's, this aperture in here gets very small and can close up. What I will say, most people I tell them just drop that crossbar by half to the entire height of the crossbar. People will not understand or read that at small sizes. The thing is, they get worried that this looks like a little triangle. Because we understand what push and pull is going to do, we know that this is going to get narrower and that the little legs are going to push out from the bottom. Yes, it looks more like a triangle on the screen. When you actually sew it, the legs will return. So if you're having trouble with that closing up, drop that crossbar. Don't worry too much about this looking like a little triangle, because if you were trying to make the triangle, you'd be very sad because those little legs are definitely going to return for you as they push out. So the other thing some people do, I have seen and I don't do very much, is this. If they're really having trouble keeping that open, sometimes you can delete this crossbar and just jump in with a couple of manual stitches. This is only for the very smallest text. And frankly, I think the look for me is not always the best, but 2 to 4 passes, you can get away with crossbars and things like serifs. If you're desperate to make a serif, so the little kind of the feet on Times New Roman, you're desperate to make serifs on the bottoms of the letters, and they're very, very small, running a couple of stitches out wider than the satin stitch can do it. At the same time, this is something I only do at the very, very smallest sizes. And then if you try and scale the design at all, the thickness doesn't change, because the passes of thread are how you build up thickness. So you'd have to actually put more stitches into it. So do this, but only at the very smallest sizes, and if you're not going to rescale it. Otherwise, there are some common things you have to do with letters, but the thing is, everything here is all based on push and pull compensation. If you understand push and pull, you know already the problems you're about to have here. First thing to say, and I usually put a graphic up here for it, 40 weight thread, the smallest letter you're usually going to run is 5 millimeters in height. And the reason that is that reliably, even on a little bit of texture, we can make a satin stitch 1 millimeter wide and it'll run very well. And 0.8 to 1 millimeter is a good size for a gap in a letter or a hole in a letter for it not to close up or cause an eyelet in the material. So if we look at any of these letters, we look like a capital E or even a lowercase e, is also why lowercase is included in your smallest letter. We have a stack of satin, gap, satin, gap, satin. There's your 5 millimeters. So when we know that we've got something that's underneath that millimeter gap, there's a likelihood that if anything goes weird with the texture, we can close that letter up. Then you want to grab the bottom of this bowl, of this loop, grab that crossbar in the middle, and drop it a little bit. Because we know, honestly, people are saying you're changing the font. Has a customer ever noticed that? No. Do they notice when the P is filled when it's not supposed to? Yes. They don't know. As long as it's open and it looks clean and legible, people will be fine with it. Making small changes to the text is not going to kill the text. Same thing with the E here. You get your E's that look like tiny 8s. Well, that's because we have that same push and pull going on. The push at the end of this stroke is pushing up into the body of the E. We take a couple stitches off the end or drop that down and change the angle. We open up that aperture and it starts to look visible. It starts to look legible. Same thing with the hook on a lowercase g like this. People are not going to notice that the descender is a little bit dropped. Grab the entire descender and drop it by a couple stitch densities, like about 0.4 millimeters, and you'll be able to open that up. The thing you're always wanting to look for is a little bit of airspace. We know that we need, on 40 weight thread at least, 0.8 to a millimeter of gap to make sure it's absolutely going to be open. So if you're looking at a hole and you're not sure, measure it, and you'll be able to find out. And by the way, I know I'm a big proponent of metrics. 1 inch is 25.4 millimeters. Learn it, love it. It is actually built into the systems. Even if you're looking at embroidery points for density on embroidery, it's measured in points. Those points are actually 0.1 of a mil. So a lot of your stuff is going to be metric. Understanding that's going to help you a little bit.